Good evening, everyone. This is Bernd Christian Giels coming to you one last time today on Wednesday, July 8th. I have my gay hitchhiker outfit on right now, so you can imagine it's going to be a very stunning episode with this particular outfit. So, as you might have noticed when you clicked on this video, half of my face was in light and half of it was dark in shadow. And I deliberately chose to have the freeze frame look just like that because it is a fitting way to introduce my next top influencer, who, as I said in my last episode, is intimately, professionally connected to Kathy Bates, who I featured in episode 14. So, who is this next influencer, you ask? Well, like I said, this gentleman is connected to Kathy Bates professionally, in that Kathy Bates portrayed characters in some of his greatest works of art, in my opinion. You might already have guessed who I'm talking about, especially if the movies Dolores Claiborne or Misery come to your mind and you know from memory the names of the cast and who wrote the book. Yes, friends, I am speaking about none other than the great writer of horror, the master of suspense and imagination, Mr. Stephen King. So, you're probably going to ask me, why is someone like you, with your background in education and world experience, counting Stephen King as one of your top influencers? And I'm going to tell you why right now. It is actually for the same reason, in part, that I chose Kathy Bates as one of my top influencers. Mr. King, Stephen King, stands as a giant in the field of horror writing and other kinds of imaginative writing because precisely of his powerful, amazing imagination. He has written some extraordinarily complex, sympathetic, horrifying pieces of art, stories throughout his very storied history. And Mr. King has actually been in the news recently, which was one reason why I thought to include him, why it came to my mind that yes, he is a profound influencer in not just the horror genre, but in the lives of many people who have read from his work. Mr. King has been in the news some, as I've seen on Twitter and elsewhere, because one of his classics that was made into a made-for-TV miniseries is The Stand. Now, just as I did in my last episode when I honored Miss Kathy Bates, so too will I now in this episode not share the full plot line of the story. And I am batting away mosquitoes, in case you're wondering. I am not waving at the empty air like a madman. So, The Stand is getting attention on the Twitterverse these days and on social media and elsewhere because the current COVID-19 pandemic has some eerie similarities in its evolution to the way The Stand, the story of The Stand, unfolded. In that story, which was a masterpiece and a very lengthy piece, Stephen King tells the story of the United States of America in approximately the year 1990, in which a pandemic spreads throughout the country after a strain of what is known as superflu, or Captain Trips, escapes from, you guessed it, a government lab in the state of California. And the only reason that it is not successfully contained is because one man, just one man, escapes the facility and, unknowingly infected, takes this strain of a highly, highly contagious flu into the world beyond that facility. He drives halfway across the United States of America before he finally succumbs to the illness that he has carried from the facility. And not until having driven that far does he die, and when he dies, the people that try to rescue him get infected as well. And despite all the efforts of the government to quarantine this small town where this man dies, the one and only carrier of this strain of superflu to escape this facility, despite all of the efforts of the government to contain the resulting pandemic, it spreads throughout the entire country quickly. And this book was written with a timeline happening in the year 1990. In 1990, we didn't have the internet publicly available, and the world was not anywhere near as interconnected and globalized as it is today, 30 years after that book was set. So it's not at all surprising that what's happening today is happening given how interconnected our world is, that something that began not even in the Americas, that began in China, as we've been led to believe, that is what we understand is the actual place that it started, something that began in China spread throughout the entire world. And now we have over 3 million cases here in the United States of America, and over 500,000 people have died throughout the world. And as terrifying as it is to see what's happening in our world, in this reality that is the reality, it is nothing compared to the death toll in The Stand. In The Stand, a vast majority of the people in the entire world die. In fact, it is so vast, the die-off, that the world is fundamentally remade. It's a world that's virtually empty of people. And eventually people come together in larger communities. And I will not share the plot of the story in full. It's an amazing book if you've never read it. If you're a teenager or a young person watching this and you've never read it, it's a gripping tale. And it might really give you pause if you read it right now in these days of summer of 2020. So, and that is what I actually find very fascinating about King's work. It's not so much the stories that have supernatural horror. It is the stories that have what I call plausible horror. And now you're asking, what do you mean by plausible horror? I mean horror that is plausible, horror that can easily happen, that is well within the realm of what we consider the range of typical possibility for things happening. So, as another great example of a plausible horror tale that Stephen King brought to life and that terrorized many children and adults years ago is the story Cujo. I remember I first saw that movie when I was a kid, and I wasn't as young as the boy character in the movie, but I was still young enough to be frightened of dogs for a while thereafter. And again, I'm not going to share the immense and harrowing plot of the story, because for any of you watching this who have never seen that movie, go watch it as soon as possible if you're fascinated with what I call plausible horror. And so all of the movies and stories that King has prepared, that he has written over the years, that I personally find the most fascinating, it is these plausible horror stories, the ones that you can easily see happening in real life. So, a pandemic that consumes the world, a dog that terrorizes a small family. These are the types of stories that are very believable because they have, in fact, these things have, in fact, happened throughout human experience. Dogs have terrorized their owners and other people. People get sick and die in catastrophic pandemics like the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. So these things happen. And it's fascinating to read stories like that these days because you can almost see the reality that we are living in playing out differently, and maybe even wonder how you would respond to the situation in one of his books by comparing it to how you are responding to a situation that's very much like one of the plausible horror stories that he has written. So, I want to go back again to imagination, though. Imagination is part of what I think makes Stephen King a master, and why I thought Kathy Bates was an amazing actress to portray some of his most imaginative tales. He has an amazing imagination, and I don't even know how many books Stephen King has written. I don't know how many movies have been made based on those books, but there are many of them. And as another great example, another movie that I saw as a kid that actually caused me to have a nightmare, thank you, Stephen King, for doing that for me, much appreciated, was the movie, yet again based on a book, the movie called Salem's Lot, based on a book by the same name, which featured, you guessed it, lots and lots of vampires. So, vampires are probably pretty high up the list of things that easily traumatize children. And I certainly found it terrifying when I watched the movie version because I think I was actually younger when I watched that as when I watched Cujo. So there's yet another example of a plausible, well, actually no, an implausible horror story, unless you do have proof that vampires exist, which in that case I would love to see it. So I can have another thing to put on my to-do list of things to be aware of. So those are just a few of King's many works. Another one that I found fascinating that was both a mix of plausible horror and less likely horror was Carrie. And the reason that I find Carrie fascinating was because, not because she got devoured by mosquitoes like I am experiencing now, but because it was set in high school and it was the story of a girl slow to reach her full development who was tormented by her female peers. And somewhat like her, I didn't grow very quickly when I first was in high school. I was a middle to later bloomer. And though I never had the kind of torment that Carrie experienced in the story of the same name, I do know what it was like to have experienced other people being really big jerks and making school a bit of a living hell at times, to where there were days when, yes, I didn't even want to go to school. And now I think a mosquito is trying to play vampire on my neck. So, Carrie was another great story because it was both plausible horror as well as some implausible, unlikely horror related to psychic ability that I will not go into details in case you haven't seen that movie either. So, the bottom line is I have immense respect for Stephen King because of his incredible imagination. And it's almost as if he has predicted certain things that have come to pass in the United States of America. And on that note, I'm going to share one last movie of his that I found fascinating, and that does hit too close to home right now in the year 2020. And that is a movie called The Dead Zone that is based on a book of the same title, from what I know. And I'm not going to tell you any of the plot of this movie, other than to say that it is eerily similar to our current political moment in the United States of America in the summer of 2020. I highly encourage you to either read the book or watch the movie. The movie was very well done, I thought, partly because it had the amazing Christopher Walken as the protagonist. Christopher Walken is one of the most deadpan actors I have ever seen. He can express most anything with the most statuesque expression on his face. It is amazing to me how he is able to be in a character and how he can be so just You wonder if it's all there. When he's in certain roles, not as a person generally. So, that's actually what I want to leave you all with for today's episode featuring my next top influencer, Stephen King. Mr. King, if you are watching this, I just want to say thank you again so much for your vivid imagination. It has both traumatized me and inspired me to be the person I am today. You have taught me the great power of imagination. You have taught me how imagination can be used to horrify people as well as inspire people, as well as cause people to feel great empathy, as I killed one, as I felt when I watched the movie Dolores Claiborne, which was another one of my favorites from your series of lengthy writing and movie production history. So, thank you, Stephen King, for your contribution to the world. Thank you for inspiring me, for all of the things you've done to inspire me. The books that you've written that I have read, the movies that I've watched based on books that I haven't read. And I am fascinated to see what you will still come up with in the years to come. But I do beg you, please, don't write as many books that seem to ultimately one day come true in this country, because some of the things that you've already written are scary enough. On that note, I am saying goodbye and good night for today, Wednesday, July 8th. It has been a beautiful day here on Cape Cod. I will be back with you again no later than Friday. I have my primary job tomorrow to attend to, and depending on how much energy I have in the morning, I might not record an episode tomorrow. I know, horrifying and shocking, but I do promise to continue to produce content on a regular basis, even if I only have 5 viewers for the next 30 days. So, thank you, everyone. You all have a wonderful evening, and I will be seeing you in the near future. Cheers.